But one of the reasons why Alzheimer's disease is expected to double or triple in the next few decades is because we're living longer. We think stress is bad, we need to avoid all of it. But in reality, like, stress is actually good. It's important. People who drink something like 2 to 4 cups of coffee a day on average have a lower risk of dementia. There's definitely evidence that like coffee and tea seem to benefit the brain long term.
Okay, guys, Dr. Tommy Wood here today with the new book, The Stimulated Mind. Congrats on the launch, man.
Thanks so much. I'm excited to get out there, and I'm excited to be here with you.
Yeah, I think when this airs, it'll be fully out. So, yeah, talk to everyone about the book, why you made it, and what's going on here.
Yeah, sure. So the book is essentially about how to improve brain function and cognitive performance today, and then through those same strategies, decrease the risk of dementia long term. So the book I basically wrote because I got to the point where working across multiple different fields, I've got a research lab where we study ways to treat brain injury. I work with Formula One drivers trying to improve their cognitive performance. We've done research looking at the different lifestyle factors that affect dementia risk. And so across all of those different spheres, we see the same things coming up again and again and again in relation to how to improve brain health, brain function, decrease risk of long-term cognitive decline, improve recovery after injury. And so all of that I kind of put together in the book. And my hope is that people can sort of use it as a manual for brain health and then apply it in their own way to improve their performance today and then also decrease their risk of dementia long-term.
Yeah, brain health is one of the most important things to focus on, I'd say, right?
Absolutely.
It affects your livelihood.
Yeah, it's having a bit of a moment right now, which I think is great. Kind of historically, we've spent a lot of time focusing on weight loss or like, you know, how we function below the neck.
Right.
Heart. Spend a lot of time as a society focused on heart disease and things like that, which are obviously super important and affects brain health too. But right now, I think recently people have felt like their brains are struggling. And they're worried about how their brains are going to function 5, 10, 50 years in the future. So I think it's good that people are starting to think about that, and hopefully that can help.
I also think there's a big movement with gut health, which there's a link there, right, with the brain.
Yeah, absolutely. They're in like constant bidirectional communication. So everything that you do that affects your body's health affects gut health. That can affect brain health. The brain obviously directly runs a lot of what happens in the gut. So yeah, the two are directly connected.
Yeah. Are you seeing the aging of the brain kind of correlated with person's health span, their lifespan?
Yeah, so there are 2 parts to that, right? So there's lifespan just being how long people live. But what people like, you speak to most people, they just care about living a healthy life as long as they live for, right? So it's probably a minority of people who really care about whether they could live to be 100 or 110 years old. But most people might want to get to 80 or maybe 90 and just they're still physically intact. They're still sharp.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons why Alzheimer's disease, in particular, which is the most common form of dementia, is expected to double or triple in the next few decades, is because we're living longer, right? So we've gotten really good at treating heart disease and other things that cause people to die sooner. So now, sort of like the next frontier of trying to prevent long-term decline in physical and cognitive function is to focus on dementia prevention and what we can do for our brains, because the primary reason that we get significant cognitive decline is because we get older, and the longer we live, the higher the risk. So that's like, now's really the time to focus on that.
Interesting. So you're seeing as the lifespan increases, the rates of dementia go up, basically.
Yeah. So exactly right. And there's 2 interesting things going on. So one, actually, over the last 100 years, the risk at any given age of being diagnosed with dementia has actually decreased. As we've improved population health, we've improved cardiovascular health. Like the nutrient status of the population has actually improved compared to, say, the 1930s, 1940s. But because of that, we have a lower risk. So if you're like 70 years old now, you have a lower risk of dementia than at 70 than you did 10 or 20 years ago. But because we're living longer, and because the metabolic health of the population is continuing to decline, right, increased risks of diabetes, obesity, metabolic syndrome, there's kind of this risk that we're going to start going back in the other direction because of aging and then because of overall physical health.
Yeah. And what role does environment play in all this? All the toxins, the air pollution?
Yeah, it can play a really big role. So we know that and air pollution is the perfect example because it's been quite closely tied to a risk of Alzheimer's disease. It causes inflammation in the brain, and that sort of compounds, all these other things that we might have going on. It's possible that other things that we might get, in the water. So in some places in the country, right, there's still lead in the water supply or in the pipes, and we know that lead is a risk factor for dementia, as are potentially some of the other forever chemicals that are sort of in the water supply. And most places are fine, but it certainly seems like doing what we can to attend to our the quality of our water, quality of the air that we breathe. So there are some really nice studies where just having an air purifier in the house significantly improves blood pressure. We know that blood pressure is a risk factor for dementia. So not everybody can move where they live, and not everybody can install water filters, go into their house, but you could get a water filter that goes in just a jug in your fridge. You can get an air purifier that sits in the rooms that you spend a lot of time in, particularly if you live near roads or other industrial activity. So even just small things like that, could add up to have a big effect.
Yeah, when I was house shopping out here in Vegas, I found a beautiful house, but it was right off a highway.
Yeah.
And I literally didn't buy it just because of that. But it was an amazing property.
Yeah, and you can overcome some of that, right? You put in some filters and things, and for a lot of people, they don't get the option to move. But like I said, there are studies that show that you can significantly improve health particularly if you're at high risk and you have a high air pollution burden. Air quality in the house can often be worse than outside because you don't get fresh air kind of coming through and clearing stuff out. So yeah, filters. And then, I live in Seattle. In the summer, we often have, wildfire season. So if it's really smoky outside, spending less time outside, or, maybe getting N95 masks or something, just when it's really smoky, in 1 year, maybe it doesn't have a big effect, but over time, that kind of stuff can add up.
Wow, there's that many fires out there?
Yeah. So I think the last several years I've lived there, usually by sort of August, end of August, there's some wildfires, and either stuff blows up from California or down from Canada, or obviously we have local fires in Washington and Montana. So yeah,
that's crazy. I didn't know that. I knew Cali had a bunch, so it's getting all the way up there.
Oh yeah. So there have definitely been times when there's this post-apocalyptic look of the sun. You sort of wake up and it's all kind of dusky orange because there's so much smoke in the air. So yeah, you have to be careful of that if you can.
Jesus, I do want to talk about social media because it's ironic. I make a living off it, but I know there's some downsides to it.
Yeah,
and I'm on my phone 8 hours a day. I just saw this thing today that I'm affecting parts of my brain because of the short form attention.
Yeah, so there's multiple things that to unpack there. You're right that there's been some interesting studies looking at how short form media affects our attention because we only train ourselves to pay attention to these short little clips.
Yeah.
Plus the way the algorithm works, it's designed to not give you all the good stuff immediately, right? So you keep scrolling, right? So it's almost like you're playing the slots, and so
right,
stuff won't happen, then you hit the jackpot. You get your nice little dopamine bump because you enjoy it, and dopamine is there to teach you about things. And so you're oh yeah, if I did this stuff and I scrolled enough, right, I get my next bump. I'm going to learn something. That's really what the brain's looking for is sort of information so it can learn, right? And it thinks from social media you're learning about your social context, which is something that humans prioritize. And so because of that, you're sort of driven to just look for these small snippets that you then enjoy, and they're relatively short. And so we know that your brain, right, the primary driver of how your brain works is how you use it. And that's essentially the whole kind of thesis of my book. And that, you can use that for good or you can use that for evil. And when we don't spend time doing things that require really deep focused attention, we lose our ability to pay attention to things for extended periods of time.
Guys, if you're into optimizing your health, performance, or longevity, there's an event coming up that's actually pretty interesting. It's called Biohackers World. It brings together a bunch of researchers, founders, and health innovators talking about things like metabolic health, gut health, stress, recovery, longevity, and AI-powered health systems. It's basically 2 days of conversations and technology focused on helping people perform better and stay healthier long term. There are over 30 talks, 35 speakers, and more than 60 companies showcasing new health tech. If that's your world, you can check it out at biohackers.world and use code DSH30 to get 30% off your ticket. It's called Biohackers World. Check it out at biohackers.world and use code DSH30 to get 30% off your ticket.
Another thing that we see is that often when we're using social media, we're not just using social media, right? You've got Netflix on and you're looking at social media and you're like chatting on WhatsApp or texting or you're doing your emails, right? And so when we do this, in the scientific research, it's called multimedia multitasking. And the human brain is only really good at doing one thing at a time, if we allow it to do one thing at a time. Yeah. But if you spend a bunch of time doing that, the brain does adapt. So you get better at dealing with multiple inputs from multiple places, but you also become more distractible because the brain is constantly on the lookout for like, what's the next thing? Where's the information going to come from? And again, it's responding to the inputs that you're giving it. So if you're trying to think about, right, you make your living on social media, you can't get off it entirely. Like, what are ways that you can potentially minimize some of the downsides?
Yeah.
One would be when you're on social media, just use social media, right? Just like focus on one thing at a time. Others will be spend, and I think this is probably the most important thing, spend some time doing deep focused work and learning some kind of skill that requires your undivided focused attention. Because we know that when people do that, they sort of train their focus muscle and then you can maintain it. And learning skills, sort of challenging ourselves both physically and cognitively, that's how we build capacity and function in the brain. So if you're, right, any of us, we have to spend our time sort of like my days are made up of Zoom calls and Teams meetings and somebody's messaging me on Slack and I have to respond to emails, right? Yep. So then it's just making sure that you spend some time during your day doing really deep focused work, whatever it is. It could be research, it could be learning, it could be preparing presentations. It's just something that really takes all of your focus and attention. And then another part of social media that's problematic is the way that our brains interpret what we're seeing. So, like I said, humans kind of prioritize social information. And in the scientific literature, sometimes it's called prime information. So prestigious, in-group, moral, and emotional, right? Because as social beings, and it was our social groups that really drove human brain evolution. We're primed to look for social cues and to understand where we fit in like the social world. So we know now, and people have talked a lot about this recently, we know that when you become socially isolated, right, that causes a stress response, that increases inflammation, it increases chronic disease risk. But we experience very similar responses when we feel socially stressed in other ways. And so that includes social stress by comparing yourself to others. And as you can imagine, if your social media feed is filled with people who are like more successful, more rich, more jacked than you are,
which most are,
then you spend all your time like internally demoting yourself. Or I'm not as good as these people. I'm not doing enough. Right. I'm not working hard enough.
That's how I was in high school and college.
Right. And then when you do that, that causes a stress response because you feel like you've decreased your social rank.
Right.
And that's inherently stressful. So for those where this isn't necessary for your job or whatever, curating your feed as much as possible so that it's not all just people making you feel bad about yourself.
Right.
Right. I think that's gonna be a really critical part of it as well.
Yeah, I do want to dive into stress because that's something I need to tackle this year. I got this Aura ring, and it says I'm stressed about 6 hours a day, which sounds like a lot.
Yeah.
As men, I think we just push through it naturally. Like I genuinely didn't even know I was stressed.
So in some ways, that's probably a good thing that you didn't know, because there's some interesting research that says that if we think we're stressed and we feel stressed and we think that stress is bad for our health, then that has a greater impact on our health.
Wow.
Right?
Well, now I know. Crap.
So
ignorance is bliss, right?
Yeah, exactly. In some respects, it is. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't like think about your stress. And we know that stress has an effect on long-term brain health and dementia risk, primarily through like physical things that we can measure, right? So there's this idea called allostatic load, which is essentially the total burden of things that you're exposed to or the things that you have to deal with. And people who have a high allostatic load tend to have higher blood sugar, higher blood pressure. They look a lot more like somebody with metabolic syndrome. They tend to have poor nutrient state or poorer nutrient status, like lower vitamin D.
Yeah.
And we're not really sure if that's like cause or consequence, but that's something that can be addressed. They have higher levels of inflammation. You can measure like CRP on a blood test. So if people are worried about their stress, one good thing to do is just like get a checkup, like make sure your blood sugar is good, make sure your blood pressure is good. And so that's certainly something that you could keep an eye on. And then you just have to think about like where are your stresses coming from and what could you potentially do about it. And the most important thing that I think people can do is think about the stresses that you have control over. And often stress and burnout are related to a loss of control. Like that's really what seems to tie stresses to increased risk of dementia, increased risk of depression as well. So can you eliminate some things, right? Just because you don't need to do them or they're not important.
Yeah.
If you can't do that, then think about ways that you can buffer against stress. So some things might be we know that we can improve our resilience to stress if we exercise. So that's been shown in several studies that if you regularly exercise, you tolerate stress better. It has less of a physiological like effect on you. You can also do a whole host of different kind of meditation or mindfulness strategies that seem to, again, improve blood pressure, improve stress responses. And it doesn't really matter which one you do, like loving kindness meditation, transcendental meditation, formal mindfulness. Just for like 5 to 15 minutes a day seems to improve our tolerance for stress and sort of like help us relax.
Interesting.
And obviously, like people can take that really deep. Like they can do hours and hours of meditation a day. In certain people, that comes with an increased risk of its own mental health issues. But just like taking a break during the day can have a big effect. And so it doesn't even need to be mindfulness or meditation. Like there are studies that show that just taking a break outside, you don't have a lot of green space around you outside, right? But if you have like a view of nature, that can help. But even just like watch you could even resort to your phone if you had to, watching stuff that allows you to truly disconnect. So there have been studies using like TV shows that you're familiar with. So like watch a rerun of something that you enjoy, right? There's none of the social stress that you have on social media. It's funny, it's relaxing, it's calming. They've done studies showing that if you watch 5 minutes of like a comedy clip on YouTube, that sort of reinvigorates you to go back and do hard cognitive work. So just like anything that kind of breaks up your day allows you to truly kind of relax and step away from whatever it is that's causing the stress. Like that, like even those small breaks can have a big effect. And then the final thing that's important is just, as you know, with whatever stresses you have left, there's some interesting research on the idea of reframing stress and thinking about what like stress is really for. And when you do that, that decreases some of the negative effects of it. So nowadays, when we talk about stress, we think, right, stress is bad. We need to avoid all of it. But in reality, like stress is actually good. It's important.
Okay.
It's there to divert resources, and that could be, blood sugar, energy, focus and attention to something that's important, right? So anytime you're really like focused and locked in, you've actually activated a small part of the stress response.
Starting something new is honestly terrifying. When I first launched the Digital Social Hour podcast, I remember thinking, what if nobody listens? What if all this work doesn't pay off? But sometimes you got to take that leap and build something anyway. If you're thinking about starting a business, launching merch, or selling products online, Shopify makes that process incredibly simple. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses worldwide and about 10% of all e-commerce in the US. It gives you everything you need to run your business in one place, from building a beautiful online store with ready-to-use templates to AI tools that help write product descriptions and improve product images. When it comes to marketing, Shopify makes it easy to create email and social media campaigns to reach customers wherever they're scrolling. Plus, they help manage everything from inventory and payments to analytics, all in one dashboard. If you've been thinking about launching a brand, selling merch, or building an online business, it's time to turn those what-ifs into cha-ching with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial today at shopify.com/DSH.
Noradrenaline and dopamine and some of these other like stress hormones get upregulated, and that's what allows you to kind of like focus in.
Interesting.
When you exercise, you also increase the stress response, right? And so cortisol goes up, adrenaline goes up, blood sugar, often blood pressure, depending on the type of exercise, right? They all go up. And this is to divert, again, resources so you adapt to whatever's coming in. So knowing that stress is actually a survival thing and it's important, and if we want to get better cognitively, if we want to get better physically, we have to activate the stress response to like divert resources to that part of the body so it improves its function.
Yeah.
So often when we're stressed, right, we're doing something cool or important, and it could be life-threatening or not, but right, your body is then responding to that and saying, okay, I need to make sure that I can do this thing, so I'm going to like divert my energies towards it, right? That's what stress does. So stress only becomes a problem when the stressor doesn't switch off, right? So like if it's starting to impact your sleep, you're constantly ruminating, you're worrying about it, right? That's definitely a problem.
Yeah.
But going into a stressful situation, they've done studies where you sort of randomize people to two groups. In one group, you sort of prime them with some videos and some scientific information. You say, do you know what, like stress is really bad for you, right? It's bad for your health. It causes things to break down. Like long-term, stress can have a big negative effect.
Yeah.
The other group is told, stress is there to allow you to do something important. Think about all the amazing people who've done incredible things under stress. And that could be like military, leaders of countries, like they use like Sully Sullenberger, the guy who landed the plane in the Hudson, right? Just like think about these people were incredibly stressed and they performed under significant pressure. And when people then go into a stressful situation, in these studies, both groups get stressed, right? And like cortisol, the stress hormone, goes up in both. But in that second group, where they talk about this idea that stress is enhancing, right? Actually, it's there to build our capacity. They also release other hormones that are associated with improvements in function, like DHEA. And we know that people who release more DHEA when they're stressed, they actually perform better under stress. So changing your mindset going into a stressful situation can actually improve how you then perform in that situation.
Wow.
So all these things become important, right? For some people, the chronic stress thing, that's where they need to focus. But for the rest of us, often it's just reframing how we think about stress, because it has an important role and we want to be able to perform in the moment when we're stressed.
Yeah, that is fascinating. That's a really good segue into the F1 work you do with these drivers who are probably experiencing a lot of stress.
Yeah. So even though these guys, they do this for a living, it can be very common for them to be stressed. And so a lot of what we do, I work with a company called Hints at Performance. We provide coaching and medical services to a good number of drivers on the grid and several teams. And a lot of my work is with the coaches. So if you've ever watched Formula One, there's always like a person who's carrying the helmet, carrying the umbrella over the car if it's hot or if it's raining, and they're like helping the driver do drills and stuff beforehand. these are usually one of our coaches.
Got it.
And the coaches are sort of like fully inserted into the life of the driver. They're doing the training program, they're doing the nutrition, they're organizing travel and all this other kind of stuff. So we work in particular with the coaches to help track data. They might have auras, they might have whoops, right? We do blood tests, we look at their blood tests, figure out can we tweak nutrition or these other things. And so often it's like, how can we make it so that we can allow these guys to relax, to switch off? If we think about this idea that how you use your brain is the primary driver of how it functions, and in particular, like skill development and driving the car, these are the best drivers in the world.
Right.
And so they get plenty of that sort of training stimulus, right? But we know if you want to adapt to a stimulus, it's the same if we're doing physical training or we're doing cognitive training. You need a period of like rest, recovery in order to adapt to it. So like sleep is when a lot of this happens. And so a lot of what we do is we think, well, they're already, they're spending time in the simulator, spending time in the car. They're in all these meetings with engineers. Like their brains are getting plenty of input. Mm-hmm. What we need to focus on is how can we get them to, relax in the short periods that they have, right? Yeah. They're basically jet lagged 9 months of the year.
Wow.
They're in a different country every week sometimes, often going several time zones. And so like they're traveling all the time, especially like sometimes they have 3 races on consecutive weekends. So you have to, where you race on a Sunday, then you have to like travel either the Monday or Tuesday. You get a day on the ground, and then like Thursday you're back in it with like practice and getting everything going for the next race. So then we're thinking about how can we build in additional rest time? How can we get them to down regulate? And so sometimes we're thinking about sleep routines. Sometimes we're thinking about breath work and other things. Sometimes sometimes it's supplements that can help with sleep. Sometimes there are some other things. So if there's like technologies that can help people sort of relax. So like right now, something that's quite popular is a shift wave chair. I don't know if you've heard of those.
I heard of that.
It's like this. It kind of looks a little bit like a lawn chair, and sort of embedded in it are these pads that vibrate really strongly. And so you kind of you do like this guided breath work.
I just did this.
Yeah, in time with the vibrations. And it a lot of people like it because it's sort of like it very quickly kind of calms them down. You can achieve the same result if you do some breath work or something, but it's quite sort of it's quite immersive.
Yeah,
right?
For me with ADHD, because breath work has been difficult with me. Yeah. Meditation with ADHD, yeah. But with that, I had no choice but to.
You have to kind of get into it and just do what it says.
Yeah,
exactly. So like with a lot of these guys, if they're struggling to switch off something like that, the kind of really. There's no other option, right? Mm-hmm. And this is the thing with things like mindfulness and meditation. They can have a big impact, but they often just become this other thing that we all know that we're supposed to do, but like nobody has time to do. Yeah. And so stuff like that can make that a little easier. So there's that kind of long-term stress component, but then similarly, sometimes when we're getting in a car, like these guys can get anxious, even though. There's millions of people watching. Often there's a lot on the line. There could be contracts on the line, careers on the line.
Yep.
So then it's kind of something very similar. Like, what can we do in the moment to kind of help them calm down? So often we're avoiding things that would be very stimulating. I think every F1 coach and driver I've worked with has a story where like they had a couple of espressos or some like a caffeine shot before they got in the car, and then they feel super jittery and they make a mistake where you're trying to navigate all these other cars at 200 miles an hour. So like avoiding things like that, but then also, what kind of things can we do to sort of like get them locked in? And that's why, you have some of those drills that you might see on TV. And similarly, we might use some other breath work or some other tools to kind of make sure that they're not too anxious or stressed or too aroused when they get in the car.
Yeah. And I feel like the mindset's what separates the top athletes from the rest.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. But it's interesting that every athlete is different. And even so often we kind of imagine that the top athletes, like nothing ever gets to them, nothing ever bothers them. They can just like sort of keep pushing through.
Yeah.
But in reality, that's not the case. And probably in most sports,
we're all human,
right? Yeah, exactly. And so that's actually the key thing. When when you look at traits of successful athletes, and this is true in the guys we work with in Formula One, but you also see it in research in like successful Olympians and other athletes. They do two things really well. So one is they're very good at emotional regulation. And so that's like when you are anxious, when you are stressed, how can you sort of get yourself out of it?
Right.
As a whole, many of the things that we've talked about.
Do you ever think about the risk you didn't take? Buying Bitcoin early, investing after 2008, loading up on NVIDIA. AI is changing jobs, markets are all over the place, nothing feels guaranteed, and at some point you realize no one's coming to save you. We're kind of the FOMO generation, but here's one thing you don't want to miss: protecting your future. If you're new to life insurance, you're not alone. Thankfully, I found Select Quote. For over 40 years, they've helped more than 2 million Americans understand their options and secure over $700 billion in coverage. As a broker, their mission is simple: to find you the right insurance policy at the best price. And they work for you for free. You can even get same-day coverage up to $2 million with no medical exam required. And even if you have pre-existing conditions, they work with companies that can help. Life insurance is never cheaper than it is today. Get the right life insurance for you for less and save more than 50% at selectquote.com/DSH. Save more than 50% on term life insurance at selectquote.com/DSH today to get started. That's selectquote.com/DSH.
Can help you do that, as well as they might have different sort of processes of getting ready. They have routines, right? Some of these things can kind of like help them get locked in if they're feeling anxious or stressed. But the other thing that they all do very well is good athletes tend to have good self-compassion, right? So self-compassion is made up of mindfulness and common humanity. These are just things to say they understand themselves and they understand that they're human. They know that humans make mistakes. They kind of treat themselves as they would treat other people, right? Rather than that kind of mindset where you're like constantly putting yourself down, like, oh, I'm a piece of shit, I gotta work harder, I'm not good enough, right? Yeah. That works for like some people, but it's actually a surprisingly small group of people. The rest, just have to, build in these tools where they actually really understand themselves. They know that they can think about times when they made a mistake and they came back, the things they learned, the things they've overcome. They can sort of treat themselves nicely. Yeah. And when they do that, that's the thing that really sets like these resilient athletes apart. And doing that allows them to focus on process, right? So they're focusing on, how can I get a little better? What can I learn? How can I improve over time? And so it's those people who are really focused on process, they end up being successful for long periods of time.
Right.
And it's just like, it's almost like a byproduct of like being really focused on the details, but also learning to sort of like know and understand themselves.
Yeah. And like you said earlier, certain athletes thrive under stress.
Yeah.
And then other ones fold, right? I'm a big NBA fan, and you'll see guys with the same talent level, they average the same points per game, but in the final 30 seconds of the game, you can see what kind of separates those athletes.
Yeah, and I think some of that, like, it might be inherent skills that the guys have learned, or that they've had. But I think a lot of that can also be learned, and it's going to be maybe about a part of the team. The kind of the situations they've been put in. Most of the guys that we work with, right, we have performance psychologists, that they're there to help these guys build the kind of psychological and cognitive tools they need to perform in that kind of setting. And that's not a weakness, right? That's part of making sure that you've ticked every box. So yeah, like everybody's gonna have a slightly different mindset. In certain scenarios, some are gonna thrive better than others. But I think it's something that we can learn, right, if we've got the right sort of situation and team around us.
Yeah. I did want to touch on diet. I know you've talked about it a lot, but anything new you're seeing, I guess, with diet and all this stuff you're working on?
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple of things that really stand out. So the first, and you kind of see this across that kind of spectrum of people that I've worked with. So like athletes on one end, and then people at risk of dementia at the other. And it's just like how much energy your body has available, which doesn't sound particularly sexy, but it's actually one of like the biggest levers, if not the biggest lever in nutrition. When you look across big populations of people and multiple populations around the world, if you have low energy availability, we call it, right? So you're not getting enough calories in to kind of run the whole system to maximum effect. That's very common in athletes who are doing a lot of training. They just can't eat enough, or they aren't eating enough to like maintain like all their body systems. You see changes in mood, you see changes in brain structure, you see changes in brain function. They don't sleep as well. And so you also see similar things in populations where calories are harder to come by. So certain hunter-gatherer populations where there isn't abundant food, they tend to have lower brain volumes, for example, just because there isn't as much energy to invest in building a brain. But then at the other end, which is kind of what we have is more common in the US and Europe and other countries around the world, you have too much energy availability. All right, so that's where we have metabolic disease, heart disease, high blood sugar, high blood pressure. And you see the same thing again. You see smaller brain volumes, higher risk of dementia. So there's like this sweet spot where you're eating enough food, but you're not eating so much that you start to gain weight and you start to have issues with blood sugar and blood pressure. And there are studies where they've tested diets that they thought were particularly neuroprotective. So there's a diet called the MIND diet, which is basically like a version of the Mediterranean diet for dementia prevention. And they tested that in a group of individuals for 3 years, just compared to like standard calorie restriction. So you're eating the same food. So like the MIND diet is, it's going to be nuts and seeds and and berries and kind of whole foods and like that kind of stuff, like Mediterranean, like olive oil, Mediterranean style diet. And the calorie restriction group was just eating less of the food that you're currently eating, right? And both groups significantly improved their cognitive function because in the sort of like an average US adult, the most important thing is that they're probably a little bit overweight. They've got slightly high blood sugar, slightly high blood pressure. So just reducing calorie intake is enough to have a significant effect. We do know, though, that nutrient status is really critical. So B vitamins, things like a measure of the B vitamins that are really important for dementia risk or cognitive function is homocysteine. It goes up when we're low in things like B12, folate, B6, or riboflavin, which is B2. So that's something that people is worth measuring. Your doctor can certainly get it. Omega-3s really critical, and those two interact. So there are studies where you give people B vitamins to try and decrease their homocysteine and to decrease their dementia risk, but if they don't have enough omega-3s in their diet, they don't benefit. And you also see the opposite is true. So B vitamins, omega-3s, vitamin D, iron is really important, particularly for women, especially as they enter sort of like the menopausal period. Sometimes they experience cognitive symptoms because they have low iron. So these are some of like the basics that we know are really, we have really strong evidence that if we don't hit enough of those, we have a higher risk of dementia. And so like homocysteine and B vitamins also closely tied to some like mental health conditions, depression, things like that.
So let's say someone gets their blood work, because I just got mine, and my vitamin B levels actually weren't low.
Great.
Would you still recommend these people to consider supplementing?
No. So if your level's good, so you can measure like B12, folate, and these other things separately, and then you might measure your homocysteine level. If your homocysteine is sort of under 11, under 10, that's kind of like ideal in terms of like brain health risk.
Okay.
So if you're in that range, no need to supplement. You're probably getting plenty. Yeah.
The issue with me has been D3.
Yeah.
I'm always super low.
Yeah.
I just got 25.
Yeah. Okay.
My latest one.
Yeah. So the risk really increases once you're below 20, but you at least want to be above 30.
Yeah.
I think that's where sort of like the lowest risk starts.
I do get the cold a lot. I think it's related to low D3 levels, which I've had my whole life.
Yeah. And so for you, I would definitely supplement with vitamin D.
Well, I was taking 5,000 IU a day.
Yeah.
But I guess that's not enough.
I mean, you're a reasonably big guy, so you might need to take more.
Yeah.
The average dose that gets most people in the right range is like 2,000 a day.
Really?
But you might need to take 8,000, 10,000. Like as long as you're measuring it and you're still in the right range. So when I work with athletes, there's some evidence that you might get slightly better performance if you're above 40. So kind of the 40 to 60 range is usually what we target. So if whatever you need to take to kind of get yourself definitely above 30, ideally in that sort of 40 to 60 range, like that's fine. Where everybody's different. So you just figure out what works for you.
Yeah, wow. It's almost like a science the way you describe it, how you got to get their levels to certain ranges
Yeah.
to optimize their performance.
Yeah, it is a bit of a science, right? That's what we do. But equally, it's easy to get a vitamin D test for most people. Like most doctors will do it.
Yeah. Believe it or not, my dentist made me do it because I'm getting my wisdom teeth out, and he wants you to have high vitamin D3 levels to recover quickly.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, like I said, you're not deficient. Like deficiency would be below 20. But certainly it seems like it might make sense to nudge up your dose.
Yeah. You mentioned coffee earlier, how it kind of affects certain athletes. Overall, for like general people, what are your thoughts on coffee?
Yeah. So, I like coffee a lot. I drink it every day. For like the average person, coffee is one of the most common, if not the only source of antioxidant polyphenols, which can be really important for long-term brain health and function. Caffeine in coffee also seems to have some effect. There was recently just like a big study that just came out that showed that people who drink something like 2 to 4 cups of coffee a day on average have a lower risk of dementia. And this has actually been found in multiple studies over multiple countries. Tea might have some similar effects because there's some other compounds in there that have benefit in a similar way. Some studies suggest that like even decaf has the same effect, just because you're getting the compounds for the coffee without the caffeine. The one sort of potential downside is if it's negatively affecting your sleep. So there was one study that looked at coffee intake and risk of death, and they found that those who drink coffee in the morning had a lower risk of death. But if people were drinking coffee throughout the day, there was no effect. Like it wasn't negative.
Got it.
It just didn't have an effect.
That makes sense because it's affecting their sleep.
Yeah, and it probably because it's affecting their sleep, or they're drinking coffee in the afternoon because they didn't sleep well, and then they're trying to sort of like catch up. So it becomes like a
sleep deprivation. What's it? Sleep deficit?
Sleep deficit or sleep deprivation.
Yeah.
And so it becomes like it's like a feed forward thing, right? So like you don't sleep, so you drink coffee in the afternoon, and then you can't sleep again, right? So then you need more coffee the next day. So I think there's definitely evidence that like coffee and tea seem to benefit the brain long term. But most studies would suggest like stop drinking caffeine sort of at least sort of 9-ish hours before you plan to go to sleep. So for most people, like midday is a reasonable cutoff.
Okay.
If they can, like smaller doses of caffeine, like what you might get in a can of Coke or in a cup of tea, is probably okay, like within a few hours of bed. But like a strong coffee or something like that, probably better just for the morning.
Yeah. I love talking to experts like you, because on social media you see conflicting information sometimes, and then you'll see people saying there's mold in coffee.
Oh yeah.
You'll see people saying there's microplastics in the tea bags, and you kind of get scared sometimes on what to take.
Yeah, and so this is one of the things that's most interesting to me across like all kind of health advice, and it happens a lot. It does happen a lot in food. But you get focused on one downside,
right,
and you ignore like all the potential benefits. So if mold in coffee, which we're told is like affects most of the global supply chain of coffee, right? If mold in coffee was so bad for our health, why do we see again and again and again that coffee is and like not high quality, like just like people buying it at Starbucks or whatever, right? That coffee is consistently tied with better health outcomes and lower risk of dementia, right?
Good point.
So even if mold, the mold and mycotoxins in coffee have a potentially negative effect, we're not picking it up in that signal, right? So it's possible that some people don't tolerate those as well, right? There probably is some mold in some coffees. There's mold in a lot of food. Some people don't tolerate that as well, right? So for some people it may be an issue, but I think in like the grand scheme of things, everything suggests there's a net benefit. And we see the same thing in like microplastics and mercury in seafood. Yeah. Even though even people who eat seafood with a high burden of mercury, they still have a lower risk of dementia because they're getting omega-3s and selenium and all these other things, right? So it's easy to get tied up in the downsides, and I don't want to downplay the downsides, but despite those downsides, we still see net benefit. And so microplastics in tea bags, again, tea consistently associated with some health benefits. There was one study where the tannins in tea, and so this is particularly in black tea, but you also get it in like green tea and white tea, right? The tannins bind to the microplastics so that you don't absorb them, or they get kind of so like it could be that, so like yes, there might be microplastics in the tea bags, but just the fact that it's tea also like overcomes some of the downsides, and that's why you see some benefit. So it's not that these things aren't an issue, but it's just that despite those things, we still see a signal of benefit.
Yeah, I definitely fell for that narrative, especially with salmon. I stopped eating salmon because I was scared of microplastics, but now I've just realized it's in everything.
Yeah,
all the food packaging, like you can't avoid it.
Yeah, so it is in everything, and right, even despite that, we see benefits. So like salmon and seafood consumption, you know, again has been shown consistently to be associated with better brain function, lower risk of dementia, and probably even a stronger signal than supplementing with omega-3s. And like if you're not eating seafood, you should consider supplementing with omega-3s. Yeah. But seafood is definitely beneficial. But the microplastics thing is interesting because it is, right, they are everywhere, right? They're in everything, food packaging, right? You get your coffee from Starbucks, you're going to leach out the lining of the cup. And so I think that people should do whatever they can to decrease their exposure. You know, store stuff in glass, you know, minimize use of plastic bottles if you can. If you're cooking, use wood or metal utensils, use like stainless steel pots rather than some of the non-stick coating, right? They can release a lot of microplastics, especially if they're damaged, right? So if you have damaged cookware, if you can, like replace it. But a few things have come out of the literature recently around microplastics. The first being that did you see that like number, like you eat like a plastic teaspoon or a credit card's worth of plastic like every week?
That's a classic,
right? Yeah. So there was another study that suggested that was probably off by about 2 orders of magnitude, basically meaning that it's the amount you actually consume is probably about 1% of a credit card rather than a whole credit card.
That's a big difference.
Yeah, or at least like the way they estimated it, they felt like it was probably an exaggeration. And then there's the other thing. You might have seen studies where they're looking at microplastics in the brain.
The testicles.
Yeah, in the testicles, in the heart. And so there was one study that said that people who had Alzheimer's disease had more microplastics in their brain than people who didn't. But the way that they measure microplastics in tissues, what they do is they take the tissue, they dry it out, and they essentially do this thing called pyrolysis, which is just a fancy word of saying they sort of set fire to it. They heat it up a lot, and then like what comes out, they kind of measure the different compounds in it. And what they're looking for is a compound called polyethylene. So right, you look at a plastic container or something, you see that little recycling thing, it says P in it, right? That's polyethylene. When you take fat tissue, particularly saturated fat, which is in all of our tissues to some extent, and you run it through the same method, it looks like polyethylene. So a lot of people who are sort of, you know, have looked at the methods of these studies, and there was like one sort of like important paper that came out and said that the method that they're using to measure microplastics in tissues isn't a valid method because it could just be saturated fat in those tissues that ends up looking like polyethylene.
That's crazy. So it might not actually be in.
There is probably some, right? And yes, there may well be issues because we know that like BPA, right, the plasticizers, we know they have health effects, and we know that thing like PFAs, right, also in plastics, right, we know they have health effects. Right. So it's not like we can ignore it entirely, but it's very possible that when they're measuring microplastics in tissues, they've dramatically overestimated how much we have in our bodies.
Yeah. When you think of rankings on what affects brain health the most, does plastics even show up pretty high on that for you?
If I'm honest, it doesn't show up that high. Wow. Because if we think about the modifiable risk factors for dementia, let's say, which are sort of like important contributors to our brain health today, right? So the things that affect dementia long term, they would affect your cognitive function today, even if you're 20, 30, 40 years out. And so right now, depending on which study you read and which sort of like statistical analysis you prefer, it's thought that somewhere between 45% and maybe 70% of dementias are preventable. And what they mean by that is that if you removed the risk factors entirely from the population, which is impossible.
Yeah.
But if you did do that, that's the proportion of dementias they would expect to no longer happen.
Wow.
And so the biggest risk factors are things like low education. So education is the way that we build our brains in the first place, and people who get less education have a higher risk of dementia.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Holy crap.
And that's one of the strongest risk factors for dementia is first of all, it's low education early in life, and then not having cognitively stimulating work later in life.
That one I could see.
Yeah. And so that it's the same reason. One builds function and the other one maintains function. Or actually can build function too. But and so people who just for whatever reason didn't get access to much education early in life, if they do cognitively stimulating work later in life, or they do a lot of hobbies and learn new skills, they offset a lot of that risk. So you don't have to worry about what happened earlier. You can always change that trajectory, right? By doing things, more interesting, complex things with your brain later in life.
And how early are we talking? Like elementary school or before that?
In terms of education?
Yeah, like not getting education at early age. Are we talking like as a baby, as like a child, as teenager?
Yeah, so most people, like not everybody, but like most people might finish high school, right? But then it's, not everybody gets to go to either a 2-year or a 4-year college, right? Not everybody gets to get a graduate degree. And what you essentially see is that the higher your level of educational attainment, right? So the further you get through that process, the higher and later the peak of like average cognitive function. So those who complete high school do a little better than those who never completed high school, and those who go to junior college do a little bit better than those who just completed high school, like on average.
Wow.
Right? So it's not going to be the same for everybody, but this is kind of like on average. So essentially, like, more is better. But like I said, some of that is driven by the opportunities that we get that we don't always have. We don't have control over that, right? So regardless of what happened earlier, you can then focus later. And then, so any time later in life, right? You could be in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, regardless of what education you may have had decades previously. If you start like new skill learning, you're reading, you have hobbies, you're engaged, right? You have a lot of friends, like a lot of social connection. That's going to buffer and help build cognitive function even later in life.
Got it.
But that's one of the biggest risk factors. Things like hearing loss are a major risk factor, as are vision loss. So when you lose senses, you tend to lose cognitive function.
Crap.
And
I have both of those.
But it's reversible. So.
Really?
If you get cataracts, you have a higher risk of dementia. If you get cataract surgery, that risk decreases. That hasn't been done in randomized controlled trials, but there have been trials of hearing aids. So people with hearing loss, like older in life, if you have a high risk of dementia because you have cardiovascular disease or a family history of dementia or something like that, and you have hearing loss and you get hearing aids significantly decrease your risk of dementia. So
wow,
the main thing is just to maintain it, right? So, make sure you're always up to date on like getting the right prescription for your classes, right? And if you're losing more hearing, make sure you get hearing aids if you need them. So those are big risk factors. And then on top of that, risk factors include like brain trauma, smoking, alcohol, obesity, high blood pressure. And so based on everything that we have in terms of like the long-term data of what we know about risk of cognitive decline and maintaining brain function, like I would think about sleep, physical activity, skill learning, nutrient status, physical health, lowering your heart disease risk. I think all of those things right now are where I would focus rather than getting like super worried about microplastics.
Which social media is talking about a lot about that and parasites.
Yeah. And again, I find the parasite thing kind of interesting because most of the foods that the people are worried about when it comes to parasites, like those parasites can't, like parasites in salmon or parasites in oysters, right? So there can be bacteria that can cause significant, right? You can get salmonella right from an oyster,
right?
But most of the parasites in those, like they can't survive in humans, or we have a completely different physiology. And so
wow.
And then, but that's not true for like parasites in pork. But right, you cook pork properly, it's not an issue, or it's like high quality pork if you get access to it. So I think some of these things, I'm not saying they're not important, it's just like in the grand scheme of things, they're not the things that I would really worry about.
Yeah, which is very interesting because on social media, I guess people just kind of prey on your emotions a little bit.
Yeah,
And
100%.
they'll show your Parasite video gets 5 million views.
Yeah.
Buy my Parasite cleanse.
Yeah. I've seen all these like where you get like some sushi and I'm certain it's just like stitched together stuff, right? But you get the sushi and they scrape the sushi and then all of a sudden you're looking under the microscope and it's full of parasites.
And it works. So
right.
I stopped eating sushi. You know what I mean? I used to go to sushi buffets.
Yeah.
I kind of miss sushi.
I still eat sushi.
You still eat it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure if it's quality.
Yeah, exactly.
Parasites wasn't the only reason I was worried about the mercury.
Yeah, and so again, like we know mercury is a neurotoxin. We know that particularly higher species of fish, like swordfish, tuna, right? We know they're going to have a higher mercury content. But one of my favorite studies, just because it's like it goes back to the stuff we were talking about earlier, and it's so like counterintuitive. And this won't necessarily be it's not like it's been done dozens of times, but like in this one study, they looked at the brains of people who had Alzheimer's and didn't, right? They've experienced dementia or they didn't, and they looked at mercury content in their brains. The people who didn't get dementia had more mercury in their brains.
What? Didn't get dementia?
Didn't get dementia had higher mercury in their brains, and it's because they were eating more seafood. Right?
Really?
So despite the higher mercury burden, they still had a lower risk of dementia. Wow. And that's probably because of all the good stuff that's in seafood. So, again, I'm not right. We know mercury is bad, right? And we should minimize our exposure to it. But like stop eating fish entirely or sushi entirely because of mercury kind of puts us at greater risk, because then we're not getting enough of something like omega-3s, which we know is really important for brain health. And selenium in seafood helps to offset some of the negative effects of mercury. So it's all a balance of these things, right? But it's like focusing on the negative really puts us at risk of not eating foods that could actually be a net benefit.
That's good to know. I will dabble with some sushi then. Let's go. I miss sushi.
Yeah, just like an occasional like toro nigiri, right? Just enjoy it.
Yeah, for sure. I know you've talked about creatine before. I started taking it again for mental performance. When I was growing up, I took it for just purely lifting.
Yeah. It's creatine is having its moment as well. And actually, this is a moment that I'm quite happy with.
Yeah.
I take creatine every day. I have for a long period of time, but like previously mainly for the physical side as well. When you're thinking about cognitive performance in like an average young healthy person, there isn't that much evidence it's going to have that much of an effect. The best evidence is in older adults, those who are already experiencing some level of cognitive decline. So in randomized trials, creatine seems to improve memory in particular.
Wow.
There are now also several studies where individuals with depression were randomized, and a few of them, they'd previously been treated with some kind of antidepressant. They had an incomplete response. Then they like added creatine on top, or there was a group that just like added a placebo, and creatine seemed to improve some symptoms of depression. When people are sleep deprived, multiple studies show that taking creatine helps to maintain cognitive function under sleep deprivation. The first study was in rugby players more than a decade ago now, and then there was another more recent study where they put people in. They did brain scans, they did MRIs, and they looked at like energy metabolism in the brain when people were sleep deprived, and that was improved with creatine, and they improved their cognitive function. And then sort of like finally, there's like one study in individuals with Alzheimer's disease where they gave them creatine and they saw some improvements in cognitive function. But the one sort of downside is there wasn't a control group, there wasn't a placebo group. And we know that when you give people the same cognitive test multiple times, even if they have dementia already, they will get better at it.
Really?
Yeah. So one of the big problems with cognitive function tests is what we call learning effect. You just get better at the test. This is also one reason why people who have higher levels of education do better on cognitive function tests, is just they've taken more tests in their life, right? They're just like better at tests. But even across all of those things, I think that we see this signal that creatine, particularly in settings where we have some kind of like, it's like a cognitively degraded state, sleep deprivation, or there's some evidence after traumatic brain injury, concussions, individuals already experiencing some cognitive decline, there's like creatine seems to have some benefit. We often use it in athletes, like some of the Formula One drivers take it before they get in the car, because for some people it can be like a very mild stimulant, right? So it seems to improve focus and attention a little bit, or at least that's how people feel, without being sort of like jittery and anxious, which you can get with things like caffeine.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a number of reasons why creatine is sort of like having a moment for the brain right now.
Have you figured out why some people get anxiety from caffeine? Because certain coffee brands cause it for me. It's weird.
Maybe it's all those mycotoxins.
Yeah. Who knows?
So some of it will probably be related to the amount of caffeine, because that actually can vary very widely.
That's true.
Right, it can be like 2 or 3 times more, or
depending on the company.
Less, like depending on the company, and then it's like everybody has a very different caffeine tolerance, and like some people, just like a small amount will make them feel very jittery, very anxious. When you look at the studies on caffeine and cognitive function, right? So you have people do formal cognitive function tests. When you have them do like a really complex task, so one task that's commonly done in these studies is a working memory task called NBAC, where you get like a list, like a continuous list of like letters or numbers, and then you have to remember whether the number or letter that you're being shown right now is the same as like the number back. So if it's 1 back, it's like, is it the same as the one you just saw? If it's 2 back, it's like, is it the one you saw like 2 before? If it's 3 back, which is really hard, it's like, is it the one that you saw 3 before, right? So you have to maintain the list of numbers and continuously update it to kind of like remember.
Yeah, that's hard.
Right, it's really hard. And even in people who regularly drink caffeine, if you give them like a normal dose of caffeine, like a couple 100 milligrams, and you have them do an NBAC task, they'll actually perform worse. They'll think they're performing better, but they're actually performing worse.
Wow.
And we see this with a lot of stimulants. So in people who don't have ADHD, but then you give them something like modafinil, methylphenidate, like Provigil, like any of those sort of like stimulant-based ADHD medications, you see the same thing. They feel great, right? They feel alert, they feel focused, they have high energy, but actually their complex cognitive function has decreased because they've become too aroused. So this is something that's kind of just, you have to be mindful of with some of these things. Like even with something like caffeine, it can cause an uncoupling of how you feel versus how you're like truly objectively performing, if you could like kind of measure it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? I drink coffee every morning, but just sometimes you feel good, but you're not performing better.
Right.
And so in some people, especially if they notice they get anxious or jittery if they drink caffeine, there are other compounds that you could potentially think about. So sometimes you might have something that's tea-based, right? So green tea does have some like caffeine compounds, but also has L-theanine, or you can take L-theanine, which kind of balances some of the jitters. Some people do better with the compounds that you find in chocolate. So theobromine is kind of related to caffeine, but some people can have dark chocolate, right, but can't have coffee. And there's increasing interest in like related compounds now as supplements. So paraxanthine is a metabolite of caffeine that seems to have a lot of the cognitive effects of caffeine, but doesn't have like the heart rate and blood pressure effects, or at least not the same way. So now there's coffee where they've like taken out the caffeine and added in paraxanthine instead. And then there's other things like a theacrine or T-crine, which is like it's a related compound. You can get it as a supplement now. And they've done some studies showing that if you combine it with caffeine, you need less of a dose of caffeine, but you can still get the same benefits without some of the downsides. So there's now like this whole kind of like cabinet full of stimulants that you can try if coffee doesn't work well for you. Of course, like you don't need stimulants to perform, but if people want some kind of hot beverage or something like that, then there are now like more options.
Yeah, I gotta look into that. I haven't heard of those. Do you drink any alcohol?
Yeah, occasionally.
Oh wow.
This is another thing that is sort of like come up a lot on social media, where now we're at a point where we're told that like any alcohol is bad and we should avoid it entirely, right? And I think some of the studies that have been used to justify that, they'll say stuff like, oh yeah, alcohol is a neurotoxin. And yeah, like we know that in high doses alcohol is a neurotoxin. But there are some like animal studies that suggest that small doses of alcohol can have a hormetic effect. So like hormesis being this like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah.
And there may be some of that in humans. I don't think that's the reason why I would drink alcohol, but like some studies suggest that a small amount may have a potential benefit. In reality, what I think we see from human data is that a small amount essentially has no net effect. So the studies that suggest that any alcohol is bad, they do this weird statistical technique where they try and predict alcohol intake from genetics. And then based on that, they say if you have like a higher genetic risk of alcohol intake, you have a higher risk of dementia or something like that.
Okay.
Right. But it's not actually measuring how much people are drinking.
Huh.
So it's and the way that they build those genetic scores is based on studies where they ask people how much they're drinking, and then they look at their genes to see where.
Anecdotal.
Right. Yeah. So it's not that it's anecdotal. It's just that you're now like 2 steps away from the actual thing that you care about, which is how much alcohol people are drinking. And they worry about asking people how much they drink and then looking at their disease outcomes, because when you start to develop chronic disease, maybe tied to your drinking, you drink less. So then people who drink less may have higher disease risk because of their previous history of drinking. It's kind of like difficult to unpick all of that. But basically what I think all the data now show is that if you're drinking the equivalent of like 1 or 2 drinks a week, and this is a US standard drink, and a US standard drink is 14 grams of ethanol. And some of these data were collected in the UK where 1 UK unit is 8 grams of ethanol. So like 1 UK unit is about half a US standard drink. But basically, if you're drinking something like the equivalent of 1 or 2 drinks a week, which isn't very much, there's basically a no net effect. There's maybe a slightly lower risk of heart disease, a slightly higher risk of stroke and cancer, and it's just like it's a wash in terms of like overall health outcomes. Once you get above that, so now you're averaging like more than half a US drink a day, or like 1 UK unit a day, which is like a small glass of wine. Yeah. Right. Once you're drinking more than that, then you start to see an increased risk of dementia, smaller brain volumes, right, which we know is also tied to dementia risk. So, yeah, it was my wife's birthday a couple of weeks ago. We went out for dinner. I had a cocktail. Yeah. Right. I'm having a nice evening. Like, we're having a nice dinner, like enjoying it in that kind of setting. I have no problem with that whatsoever. But if you're getting to the point where you're like drinking every day, or drinking several drinks a week, or drinking several drinks multiple times a week, then we know that's tied with a higher disease risk. But like the occasional drink, I don't think it's anything to worry about.
Yeah, and that was my father. He drank every day.
Yeah,
typical Irish drunk. But that scares me because I do have the APOE4 gene from his side.
Yeah,
and I did see in his later years that there were signs of Alzheimer's, in my opinion.
Yeah, and so my grandfather was also an alcoholic, and he essentially died because of dementia, right? One of the complications of dementia. So like I know this is a real thing. This is a real risk, and like some people have a higher risk of excessive drinking or alcohol abuse, right? That has genetic components as well. So if you're not somebody who can drink in small amounts and just drink occasionally, then it's probably better to not drink at all, right? Yeah. Because we know that going too far the other way is gonna carry a lot of health issues. And so like to kind of segue onto the ApoE4 thing, the main thing that happens with ApoE4 is it's a risk multiplier, right? So if you have other lifestyle related risk factors, then having a copy of ApoE4, they have a bigger effect on your dementia risk than somebody who doesn't have ApoE4, right? But there are also studies that suggest that in the absence of those risk factors, there probably isn't that much of an increased risk of dementia or heart disease, which is another. So ApoE4 is also a risk factor for heart disease. So there are studies looking at like different hunter-gatherer tribes, like the Bolivian Chimane. There was a study looking at the Nigerian Yoruba in Nigeria. There was a study looking at indigenous Americans here in the US. There was a study looking at Sicilian Americans either in Italy or over here in the US. And in all of those populations, like when they're in their sort of native environment or their ancestral environment, ApoE4 wasn't associated with an increased risk of dementia. So it seems like most of the risk comes from an interaction between ApoE4 and the modern environment. So there are studies that show that if you have 1 or 2 copies of ApoE4 and you then drink excessive alcohol, right, that you get a bigger bump in your risk than if you didn't have ApoE4 and you drink a lot of alcohol. Same for low diet quality, same for low physical activity. So I think the main thing to do is just focus on the risk factors that you have control over, because the ApoE4 is like a risk multiplier rather than just like a baseline increased risk that there's nothing you can do about.
Got it. Great advice. Well, Dr. Tommy, this was amazing. Where can people keep up with you, get the book, and follow your work?
Yeah, thanks. So the book, you can go to either my website, drtommywood.com, or thestimulatedmind.com. Follow me on Instagram at drtommywood, drtommywood. And then I've also got a Substack and a podcast with a friend of mine, Josh Turkner, who's a neurologist. Go to betterbrain.fitness. You can sign up for the free Substack and everything's there.
Beautiful. Check them out, guys. We'll include the links below. See you next time.
Thanks for watching all the way to the end, guys. It means a lot. Please click here if you want to watch the next episode, and please subscribe to the show. It helps us get more guests and helps grow the brand.